She did mention that I've been serving as a cancer counseling specialist, and that's actually been an evolution of a title that I got permission from the Board of Psychology to use. Originally, I was referring to myself and still somewhat go by a psycho-oncologist. And that doesn't really sound like the kind of professional anybody is really excited to go see. So with some promptings from my colleagues, we did develop the cancer counseling specialist as being the title that I advertised myself as. But I'm just a psychotherapist. I do outpatient counseling most days of the week, and I just specialize in working with this particular population. This talk that I'm giving tonight, I'll be sharing my slides with you. I've also provided Gilda's Club with the slides themselves, and they've agreed to kind of disseminate them to you either now or after the talk themselves. So if you're planning on taking notes, feel free to do so, but you will also get a full copy of all the slides I'm going to be sharing with you during our talk. The talk itself is something I've given a couple of times over the years. And grief by its nature is a very personal experience. And so as I talk, I kind of have a way of just kind of trying to present things in a way that makes sense, but is also very to the point. I may say things that sound insensitive, but that's not really my intent. My real hope is that you walk away from today just with a different way of conceptualizing or thinking about the grief that you may or may not be experiencing. And if you only take away one tidbit, one actionable step that you can incorporate into how you're grieving or into your processing of your own loss, then I'd consider that a success. So I guess my overall advice is get rid of the parts of it you don't like and just take away the parts that you do. I'm going to share my screen now just so we all have a good look at what we're going to be talking about. And this is always in the way. Here we go. Slideshow from the beginning. So as Christina mentioned, today we're going to be talking about grief. And the whole idea with grief is that it's a process. The idea that it ever has a beginning or an end is somewhat false. The idea that we ever get to a point where we're no longer grieving is kind of a misnomer, but rather thinking of it as a process, then it really allows us the ability to recognize that it comes, it goes. It may not always be the dominant thing on our mind itself, but that it's always kind of there in the background. It can be easily triggered, and that these losses, they become almost like scars from old wounds. You can still see the evidence that it was there. It may still be sensitive when you brush up against it, but that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means that this is now part of your story and you're now going to continue on through life with it, rather than it being something that heals fully, that you're able to forget about and pretend as if it never happened. A lot of the theoretical basis for our talk today comes from a lot of different areas of psychology. And so the message overall would be considered integrative because it incorporates grief theory and cognitive behavioral theory and humanistic theory as well as existential theory. And some of the key words that you're going to hear today are stages of grief, which you may or may not be familiar with, self-care, intentional living, emotional awareness. There are other ones like radical acceptance and mindfulness that we'll be talking about. But you may have heard some of these terms before, but really my hope is that we all kind of integrate them into some kind of structured format for which you can then see the grief process more clearly. As I said, when you do experience a loss of a person, you're not just losing that person's life, but rather you're actually losing everything that comes along with that relationship. The loss of future plans, loss of hope, relationships, security, sometimes when you are going through that cancer-related experience with them, that you actually lose your ignorance of your own mortality, because while they're facing their own, we end up having to ponder our own mortality. And so even the loss of that thing that is inevitably going to reach us all, but now we can't escape with thinking about it, thinking about our own life and our own mortality, that really becomes and starts to contaminate our ability to be in the present. That simply that loss alone can be one of the ones that we grieve the most. And each one of these losses, whatever it may be, they all invoke their own specific grieving process. And so the whole of it isn't even just for the loss of the person, but just everything that comes with it. And I'm going to be using the word process a lot today, and that's very intentional, just to help everybody understand that this never really does end. And I like to use the example that it's like the upkeep of your house, that there's really always more work to be done. And so the grief process is like that too, that there's always another pocket of grief just waiting to be triggered or to be awoken or to be discovered. And so if we're surprised by that, then it can catch us off guard, can even make us upset or angry that we still haven't gotten over this loss. Whereas if we understand that it is a process and we can almost expect that it will be reawoken in different circumstances, then we're more open to the healing process and how it needs to unfold over time. You've probably heard of these stages of grief, but I like to call them states of grief. I think the word stages all too often is associated with some kind of linear progression where you go through stage 1, 2, 3. Whereas really I like to call them states of grief, because the actual experience of grieving is a real jumble of all of these different. So you have denial and sadness, anger, bargaining, and acceptance. And as I stated, there is no linear, orderly pattern or of predictability. There's no rational explanation for how or when they present themselves. There's certainly no way to speed up the process of grief. And a lot of our talk today is going to be identifying and exploring different ways in which actually we inadvertently prolong that process and make it more painful than it perhaps needs to be. No two people grieve the same, and actually no two experiences of grief are alike even in the same person. All too often we're vulnerable to comparing this loss to previous losses and wondering why there are so many differences that actually they aren't comparable in any way, and there's nothing in previous losses that in some way predicts the trajectory of future losses or that grieving process. Each one of them affects us differently. As I stated, there's no real order to how these things happen, that we can spend a whole month or a couple months in one of these states of grief, or we may wake up and have sadness, have a bit of bargaining with our coffee, experience anger during lunch, some denial around dinner, and then find ourselves in a place of acceptance by the time we go to bed. That is, by all rights, what normal life looks like when you're in a grieving season. I use the word normal. That's kind of a faux pas here for psychologists, but I use it a lot actually, and I have to say my clients, I think, appreciate it, because everybody wants to feel like what they're going through is normal. And I think that's really important, that normal is different for every single person. What a big part of grieving and making it a seamless or a more fluid or a more embracing experience is when we foster a posture of this is normal, that this is how it's happening for me. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be something I like, but that this is what my body's going through and that it's normal for me. And so I always encourage the thought process that what I'm experiencing is normal, even though that means something different for everyone. So anger by itself, a lot of how I'm going to present it is kind of like in two different ways. I want you to see perhaps in your own process of these states of grief, hopefully that there are ways in which we can process it in passive ways, where we almost kind of are just allowing the time to really dictate how our process goes along. Sometimes we engage with it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we pretend it's not happening, sometimes we're fully acknowledging. And that the passive ways tend to be those in which they don't always communicate the particular state of grief that we're in accurate ways. Sometimes we might feel misunderstood. Sometimes we're not actually getting heard. Sometimes it's not actually effective. And so I always kind of contrast these passive ways of communicating whatever state of grief we find ourselves in versus active ways. And again, the goal is one and the same. I imagine none of us intentionally do things in passive ways. We just happen to automatically fall into some of those behaviors. But that if we knew that we had a choice between behaving that way or well, communicating how we're feeling in those ways versus there are more active, more accurate, more effective ways to process that emotion and communicate to our support system that this is where we're at today, that we might choose maybe more the active than the passive, especially if we thought we'd get a different outcome from it. And so some of the passive ways in which you can imagine one might communicate anger would be through being moody, irritable, anger outbursts, rejecting other people's help, so intentionally isolating ourselves, cutting off ties from people, because often anger gets projected onto some of the relationships around us, even though it has nothing to do with it. It just has everything to do with this state of grief that we're in. Sometimes we make rash decisions and we might purge our belongings, giving away things that hold meaning for us. I threw in guilt there because anger towards ourself is often experienced as guilt. And again, even though we're not actually angry at ourselves, anger has a way of trying to get sticky. It tries to attach itself to different things rather than us just being angry without being angry at someone else. And so a more active way of perhaps acknowledging that we are in an anger state of grief is really recognizing how powerful we feel when we're angry. Anger is purposeful in that way, perhaps evolutionarily, because it enables us to do things that we maybe wouldn't otherwise do if we weren't experiencing that anger. But when we're in a grief-related anger state, the real trick is how to just be angry without actually being angry at anybody around us, which can hurt those relationships. So one way in which you might acknowledge your own anger very plainly is to state out loud and loudly is, I'm angry today. I'm not angry at you, I'm just angry. And then again, I like to throw in the fact that it's totally normal to be in a state of anger. Now, I am angry today isn't always on everybody's tongue. It's not always everybody's favorite phrase, certainly not first thing in the morning. But all that's really doing is bringing authenticity to this experience. Is being honest with yourself, perhaps, firstly, and then, if you so choose, to those around you. That to deny these states as they arise, we get into some of that passive behavior, because anger itself and all of these emotions, we don't have this endless capacity to just hold on to these states of grief, that they have to be processed, they have to make their way through us. We have to express them in some outwardly way. Otherwise, they do take up residency in us and become these toxic residents that then can emerge when we don't want them to. Sometimes we might get angry at somebody else, but then we get a disproportionate amount of anger that comes out as a result of that. That's usually because there's anger already in there just waiting to be expressed, and it's just taking advantage of a time in which we're expressing anger in a different situation. So just by saying these things very plainly, very honestly, very specifically, it's a very validating experience for that emotion. Whether we like that emotion or not is kind of irrelevant, because our body given that it's way more intelligent than what we want or don't want, is that it feels that anger whether we are trying to acknowledge it or not. Once you find yourself acknowledging that anger, it's good to have an outlet for it. Now, I throw a couple of these up here, and I think I put journaling on every single one of them, because I believe that unless you're in some kind of intense outpatient psychotherapy experience, that journaling is a great way of outwardly expressing things. It's a victimless crime. You can write whatever you want. You can burn the book when you're done with it, or you can save it forever and read it to your grandchildren. But the idea is that having a way to take something that's inside and not really doing you too much good inside and bringing it outside yourself and giving it a place to go, that it's much more tangible, it's much more alleviating. It means that you don't have to carry that anger around with you as you go into your day. You don't have to take it into your relationships with your loved ones. You don't have to take it to bed with you. That you can put it in a journal. That journal can go in a drawer somewhere and you can close the drawer. And I know a lot of that is kind of philosophical and symbolic, but actually that validation that anger is really looking for is one and the same, that it still has that same experience. Screaming, I'm sure we've all done that at the steering wheel every once in a while, and you know what? The steering wheel doesn't write letters of complaint to us back saying it wishes we wouldn't do that. In fact, that's very cathartic. It's very healing and alleviating of our tension when we do that, when we allow ourselves to yell at inanimate objects. Sometimes we like to write letters, or I like to write letters. I guess nowadays people might like to write to emails or texts, and those are really appropriate. However, you would never want to send those emails. The authenticity that you bring to those emails is the real benefit, the rawness of the emotions you might express. That's really the felt benefit of writing some things like that, just making it very real for ourselves. However, what we don't want is to suffer the consequences of anybody reading that, because we're not really going to put it in the letter in the way that we would present it to anybody else. And so we would write letters to never send, or texts that we delete, or emails that we never address to. Just again, similar to the journaling, just the ability to write those and to be able to put that anger somewhere into some real capacity. It's very validating and expressive. Exercise is also a great way to express anger, to bring your anger on the road with you if you're going for a walk, or to the gym, or to your yoga class, that can be a symbolic way of processing and really working through that. And then, of course, talking about it, whether that's to a counselor or a loved one, can be very beneficial. Sadness is nobody's favorite part of grief. You know, it tends to be the emotion that we feel, and it feels very, very okay to be sad, certainly closest to the loss experience. However, as time goes on, that sadness may linger, and residues of that sadness may come back up as time goes on. But in a way, the implied message from our support systems, and maybe even in our own mind and our own philosophy, is that it becomes less and less okay to still be expressing that sadness. And so we might find ourselves falling into habits of isolating ourselves because we don't want to burden others, not even getting out of bed as a way of communicating, I'm just not going to engage with the world today. Actually avoiding relationships and activities because, again, they've heard me cry enough. And maybe even I'm tired of myself crying. That too is just a real denial of something that's happening inside of us. And then, of course, the faking good or pretending as if we're not sad, as if we're doing everybody around us some kind of favor. That all of that just can add up to a very invalidating experience for our sadness, where even though our body communicated it to us that day that it needed to feel and process some sadness, that we didn't give it an adequate outlet to be able to do so. And so a more active way of perhaps acknowledging that sadness is to recognize that it's an uncomfortable state and nobody really likes to be sad, but we do have to find a way to allow that to happen without shutting down completely. And so if nothing else, just to acknowledge to ourselves initially, and then if we so choose to those around us, that I'm feeling sad today. You know, when someone else that you perhaps are in relationship with feels sad, oftentimes we might treat them differently on that particular day. We might accommodate their mood. We might encourage them to do nice things for themselves, or we might take it upon ourselves to go out of our way to care for that person. We encourage them to change different activities around their mood that is no fault of their own and they didn't prepare for and they weren't planning on, but still you would perhaps approach them with compassion and understanding that we need that too when we're feeling sadness. And oftentimes it has to start with us, that we have to be compassionate to what our unique needs are. I often use the example where if in hurrying to this meeting I had, run into my house, I have a hallway table that I often hit my hip off of. And if I ran into my condo and I rocked my hip off that, I would likely yell very loudly, "Ow, that hurt." And so I would be very expressive and open and outwardly honest about the pain I was physically feeling in my hip. I might sit down, I might rub it, really nurturing that injury, trying to get it back to health. I might think about the pickleball that I'm playing later today and really consider if that's still in my best interest. And so I'm accommodating that physical injury as a part of how I'm going to care for myself now that this unexpected injury occurred. And so you can hear just how much care and attentiveness I would give to this totally out of the blue, unexpected injury that I endured. And oftentimes we don't give that same level and attention and compassion to emotional injuries that we go through. Yet those have the same needs that our physical injuries do. The other thing too, unfortunately, is that our emotional injuries are not visible to other people. And so we have to communicate them. They can't see the cast on our arm, they can see the cast on our arm. They can't see our broken heart. And so that does, the ownership on us is to really to be able to communicate that to other people so that they too are able to help us care for ourselves. And so things you might, again, like what I mentioned, things that can really help us process that sadness, make room for it in our day, even though we didn't know we were going to feel that way, is, to engage in some journaling, to adjust your day and your expectations of yourself, because when we're feeling sad, we perhaps aren't our same level of productivity that we are when we're in a different state of grief or not grieving at all. Tears become our body's most natural release of tension. That's why we cry when we're excited. That's why we cry when we're happy, when we're afraid, and when we're sad. And so holding in our tears is like trying to take control over any of our body's natural functions. It just wasn't meant to be. We don't try to tell our kidneys how to do their job. We don't try to stop our stomach from digesting our food. And so the thought that we in some way can exercise better judgment over our tear ducts and hold them in when all they need to do is release, it just seems somewhat over the top and unnecessary. The other thing too about sadness is we almost, to do what's best for ourselves when we're feeling sad, we need to acknowledge how we feel, which is the sadness part of it, but almost in a way counteract what that's prompting us to do. Sadness by its nature can feel very isolating. It causes us to not want to engage in self-care, to engage with other people that may care for us or lift our spirits or just be compassionate and empathic to what we're going through. And so I would challenge you to really seek out those relationships when you're feeling sad. If nothing else, you could set up a little experiment for yourself that one day when you're feeling sad, you keep to yourself and you just kind of note for yourself how you feel over the course of the day. And that if that same emotion arises in the near future, that you would then spend that day seeking others and seeing what the difference is and really decide for yourself what's best for you. Denial is kind of a nasty word. It gets a bad rep, almost as if it's some kind of bad thing, but it's a very normal and natural state of grief when it comes to processing a loss. In many respects, it's almost like a break, that if our psyche determines that we are bearing the weight of too much loss, or that it wants to protect us from feeling the fullness of what we've just experienced, that it will put us very intentionally into a state of denial. I'm always very much in awe, as are, I imagine, many people when they're attending a funeral or having or observing somebody making arrangements following a loss of a human being. And quite frankly, the necessity to be able to function and to go through the motions and do what you need to do to get those very necessary activities done, I imagine that that's partly because we go into a state of denial. We're somewhat removed from the fullness of that emotional experience. And so when you find yourself in denial, whether you're aware of it or not, you may find yourself refusing to acknowledge that things happened, and that's okay. You might find yourself using the phrase, "I'm fine," even though there's no rational explanation that would suggest that we actually are fine. We might find ourselves behaving as if nothing happened, or even avoiding things like pictures or items. We might start to store away mementos or reminders of that person. And again, just to acknowledge, these things aren't wrong. It's not wrong to do these in passive ways. It's just if we're not aware that we're only doing them perhaps because we're in that moment experiencing a bit of grief denial, rather than, say, choosing to cope with the denial or process it in a more active way, then we can be vulnerable to getting stuck in some of these things, because it can feel kind of good, almost just telling people you're fine. It can feel really good avoiding dealing with a lot of the grief-related things that you might have lying around. And, all of this is really temporary. It does perhaps just kind of like hitting the pause button on our grief process, but it is okay. It is okay to find yourself in a place of denial. It's not in any way disruptive to the process long term. And quite frankly, we get to develop a state of ignorance in many regards. We get to go back into a place where this wasn't something I had to deal with or was really consuming my mind and my dreams and my quiet times. And so the real trick of processing denial is allowing it to happen, but not making any decisions that then make grieving harder in the end. You can imagine, just going back a slide, that doing any of these things on a regular basis could lead to bigger problems down the road. And so to behave as if nothing happened, people just stop asking. Saying that you're fine, people just stop coming around. And that's not because you don't need them to. It's just because you've presented yourself in a way that suggests that you've moved on. And so perhaps when you do find yourself behaving in a denial-like way, or even where the grief itself isn't something that you're so consumed by, that ultimately you might consider, I'm likely in denial. And it's difficult to be aware of your denial, because denial is almost like an abandonment of awareness. Again, we go on with our day and with our activities and with our routine as if everything was as it was before the loss experience. And so it's only when we notice that, or maybe other people say things to us like, "Gosh, you're handling this really well," that could be a real indicator that I think I might be in denial today. But that's okay too, that I'm going to allow myself not to think about it today, but please talk me out of making any big decisions. And so, again, just that it's totally normal to be in a state of denial. So when you are in denial, get stuff done. Do stuff that you can't when you're feeling some other kind of way. Expect it not to last too long, because it doesn't. It typically is perhaps the shortest lived state of grief. Sometimes we often feel bad when we're feeling good. Should statements enter into our mind like, shouldn't I be sad today? That we don't have to treat all of our thoughts as if they're truthful. Other people might even suggest, gosh, I almost would have thought that you were going to be more sad than, or I would have found you more sad than I did today. That too, sometimes we're vulnerable to having guilt thoughts like, shouldn't I be feeling differently? But actually, you're not in control of what state of grief you wake up in or find yourself in. That we just have to acknowledge when we are there, make it okay, remind yourself that it's normal, and then proceed on. And then again, I also threw in there that we make 0 major decisions. That's probably a good thing to consider whenever we go through a major crisis or a major loss, is that because our mindset isn't in what's in our best interest long term. When we're in denial, we're just about, how do I avoid interacting with my grief today? And so to look at a wardrobe full of clothes and donate everything to Purple Heart, that can feel good, except when we're not in denial, we might think differently about how necessary it was to purge ourselves of all of those belongings. So bargaining is kind of an interesting word. It becomes this state where we actually start to think about the events that led up to the loss. We start to play out the different scenarios that may or may not have changed the outcome, perhaps. And we engage in this thing called magical thinking. Magical thinking being, if only this, then something else would have happened. Or if I only had done things differently, that perhaps there would have been a different outcome. That's referred to as magical thinking because oftentimes it's very easy to go back in time and do things differently in our mind. But really at the time, we did the best we could with the information we had. And so when we're feeling bargaining, we have a lot of those if and then questions in our mind. It creates a lot of uncertainty for us. And uncertainty is a very difficult emotion to tolerate. In fact, it might be the most intolerable experience for human beings. And so whenever we find ourselves experiencing a lot of uncertainty about, did this have to happen? Could it have happened another way? That it's likely we just are finding ourselves in a state of bargaining, which is a very normal state of grief. If we ever find ourselves making deals with or promises to God, please take this away and I'll serve on the communion committee forever. That ultimately, that's just us trying to bargain away this feeling of pain that we're in, this grieving process altogether. May have even found ourselves making or saying prayers like that prior to the loss itself. And then, of course, after the loss, we then might find ourselves experiencing anger because those deals and those promises didn't prove true. So overall, we're really just imagining different ways to have potentially changed the outcome itself. We also might experience regret, where we are actually intentionally putting a sense of responsibility on ourselves, as if this outcome came true because I didn't see the signs or because I didn't behave in some specific way. And again, all of these things, they aren't necessarily helpful, because at the end of the day, the fact that we're having these thoughts, the fact that we're experiencing the regret, it doesn't actually mean anything. It just indicates that I'm in a state of grieving, and therefore it's very normal and understandable. By its nature, bargaining is a very anxious state of grief. And so it can be quite uncomfortable. That the trick is recognizing when it happens, or sorry, when it's happening, and avoiding the thoughts avoid allowing the thoughts to torture you, because we could play through those what if scenarios all day long. And at the end of the day, nothing really changes how it all played out. One of the ways in which you might find yourself identifying or even communicating to those around you is just by saying, you know what, I keep thinking about how it happened and how badly I want to change it. I must be in a state of bargaining. And again, just to point out that it's totally normal to be in that state of bargaining. It's all part of that same process. You know, to write down these what if scenarios, especially if something about the way we process things in our mind, it all kind of happens in this really tiny square centimeter of our front right lobe. Whereas when we write stuff down on a page or we say it out loud and our ears hear us say it or our eyes read it off the page, we actually process something with the creative part of our brain. And in that moment, those two parts of our brain actually talk to each other, and the synapses cross at the optic nerve behind the eyes, which bumps right up against the hypothalamus, which is our mood center. And as a result, we get a bit of dopamine. Dopamine being our feel-good drug, leaving us with the moral of the story that it feels better writing stuff down and saying stuff out loud and hearing us say it than it does to just think about these things. And so that's my best pitch of the night, to really sell this journaling idea, but that writing this stuff down can actually feel better because you get that little bit of dopamine for having done so. And definitely we have to choose and be intentional about not assigning truth to our thoughts, that they are just thoughts. And even though it feels like if I just made that different choice, that we might be dealing with a different outcome, that's not true. That's that magical thinking that we talked about. So really make note when you're making comparisons, because those often feel like criticisms, and also make note of when you're engaging in that kind of magical thinking. Whenever you find yourself making those what ifs or playing out those what if scenarios in your mind, you can just say to yourself, I'm just bargaining right now in my mind, and I don't have to do that. It just means that I'm grieving. You know, I like to use a lot of declarative words, and I'm not trying to present this in a way that once you say that, everything goes away and you're able to just do cartwheels and, you know, live life to the fullest, that your grief still continues. But really, the more you're aware of your grief process, it just helps to recognize that you're in a vulnerable state, that our expectations for ourselves can be adjusted, that we can exercise greater compassion for what we're going through. And in the end, just having the words and the language to be able to articulate to ourselves and to those around us can help depersonalize really all of the thought process itself, which means to bring us into a very egocentric, introspective state of being where we get lost in our own grief process. I'm trying to think of an example, but perhaps someone might come over and we're cooking soup, chili, if you will, and the minute they come in the room, they start to tear up. That if we were to look at them, we might consider them to be sad. We might wonder if they're had a difficult day, but actually their ability to just say, oh, it must just be the onions that are causing my eyes to weep like this. It really de-escalates any bigger meaning we might put on that behavior, de-escalates or really depersonalizes any kind of feelings that we might have around whether we should or shouldn't be crying, but to be able to just really understand that I'm just going through something and it's not in my control, and I'm just going to have to go with it to a certain degree, but that doesn't mean I have to make big decisions out of it. It doesn't mean that I have to treat my thoughts as if they're truths, that it can really help you feel more empowered rather than victimized by your own grieving process. Acceptance perhaps is the best way to look at when you're not experiencing the other 4 states of grief. It's not when grieving is over. You know, nobody arrives at your front door, rings the doorbell, and presents you with a certificate saying, well done, you've reached acceptance, you no longer have to think about this loss. But rather, it's just an opportunity for you to feel good. It means that you've done good amount of processing of the other states of grief, and that for whatever reason, your body is giving you a break. And you're able to actually just be more present to what's going on around you rather than having the weight of this loss upon you. And so the trick is really allowing yourself to feel good without feeling guilty about it. Because realistically, something could trigger you, something could brush up against that scar or that wound and really reawaken any of those states of grief. And so when you are feeling in that place of feeling good, really allow it to happen, guilt-free, because it could change any minute. And so how you might communicate that actively is just by acknowledging other people, I'm feeling okay today, genuinely. And I threw in genuinely, of course, because we're all at risk of saying we're okay if we're more passive about any of the other states of grief that we're going through. But that we also recognize that even though I feel better right now, I know that my grief is a process, and so it could change at any minute. And it's totally normal to feel good during a grieving process and during and after a loss itself. Life is intended to go on. So when you are experiencing acceptance, really allow yourself to enjoy things. Really choose to live, re-engage in activities that perhaps have fallen to the wayside, things that you used to do, or things that you've never done before that you always wanted to. It's very easy, especially when you're caring for another person, to actually forget that you even have needs. And so it is part of the grieving process to bring you back to just your life. That your life existed before the loss, and it's going to exist after the loss. And it's going to look different for sure. But that doesn't mean we can't choose to still engage in it. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or that we should feel bad about making new memories or experiencing joy or happiness. And so whatever way that seems best for you, I encourage you to engage in it. Because of course, being a process and being unpredictable, we don't know how long we're going to feel this way. So to really make it actively okay for ourselves, making it actively okay to feel that acceptance. So this is a good and normal feeling is a good thing to say to ourselves, rather than why don't I feel one of the other 4 states? And avoid putting meaning on it, because again, this doesn't mean anything that you find yourself here. It's just wherever your body is in its own process. So I hope the idea is that we really understand this isn't something that's in our control, that we aren't in control of our grief process, but we're very much in control of how we treat ourselves while we're going through it. It can help reduce our feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, so we feel that sense of empowerment and less victimized, which can lead to resentment of our own grief process. And we focus our efforts more intentionally on how to care for ourselves, rather than how do I get through this, or how do I fix it. We get to own our own grief process rather than fearing it in the end as well. So that passive versus active comparison, the overall difference is that our passive ways of communicating things can oftentimes give us the feeling of control of how we're handling our grief. Whereas by engaging in our grief process actively, it actually puts us in control of how we're handling our grief process. That might be a lesson for another talk. But vulnerabilities to perhaps engaging in some of these more passive approaches, vulnerabilities to prolonging our grief process beyond what it would perhaps naturally take course of, is if we're a private person, if we consider ourselves to not talk about our business to others, that the idea of joining a small group or, admitting that 8 months later we had a bad day and a pocket of grief was reawoken and we found ourselves behaving in out of character ways, that fear of judgment that we often carry with ourselves, that all humans feel, that really makes us vulnerable to not actively engaging with our grief. If we're impatient and we're just trying to rush to the end as if that end had existed, that often causes us to perhaps force ourselves out of certain states of grief. If we struggle with emotional communication, again, really not having the language or the courage to bring that authenticity and rawness to our relationships. If we're in the habit of caring for others, and yet here we are in a state of grief where our needs have to be made priority. If we're not in that habit, that too can cause us to just go back into those habits where we deny our own grief in the effort to care for other people. If we find ourselves being busy is another word for distraction, which can really help us, especially if we're in a state of denial, because all we want to do is just get done what we need to get done. That might mean going to work way sooner than one might expect. And that's okay. It's just unlikely to last. The problem is that if we go back to work too soon in other people's minds, but just at the right time for ourselves, without acknowledging that we're in this process and we feel like we're capable of re-engaging in these normal activities now, but we might not tomorrow or next week or next month, then that puts a lot of pressure on us to maintain that behavior, perhaps almost hurting ourselves in the end. So whenever we find ourselves, being busy or re-engaging in those activities, let's just really acknowledge, I feel good today and that's why I'm here, but there's no guarantee I'm going to feel like this tomorrow. If you're a self-professed type A person, you just like to fix it. Let's find the problem and get rid of it. Well, the problem is there's no problem, that this is a natural process, that we don't, every time we have a bowel movement, we don't think, gosh, why did that have to happen? Why do I have to feel this way? Why do I have to go through this process? The reality is we just go with it because we understand it to be normal and necessary. And also, if we don't have the habit of engaging in self-care, if we don't have good practices, that can also mean that to recover from a grief, or from a loss rather, or to engage in a grief process in an active way, that we're actually learning new skills. And so some of the literary references I've put at the end of these slides, that they might help you in the event that you find yourself without that kind of self-care skills. Things to avoid, and this list isn't rigid rules, really, these are just guidelines. It's okay to do these things, but it perhaps prolongs the grieving process longer than it really needs to. And some of them also have unintended consequences. And so, sometimes we do need a stiff glass of whiskey. I know I do every once in a while. And it makes sense to numb ourselves to a degree when we're feeling a lot of pain. And it's not wrong to do that. It's just not the habit we want to get into, because it can almost make it more painful in the end in spite of its short-term benefits. So we want to avoid using substances consistently to soothe some of these states of grief. We don't want to isolate ourselves from significant relationships. We as human beings aren't really made to do things all by ourselves, which is partly why we're feeling the loss that we are when we lose someone close to us. And so we have to be intentional about seeking out those significant relationships. We don't want to be too guarded or trying to keep things private, again, as if we're doing other people around us some kind of favor, or if we're fearful of their judgment. If we fail to ask for help when we need it, if we force ourselves any states of grief, and then of course we never want to feel as if our grieving process is done. It just means that we're feeling that state of acceptance, but grief is a process itself. So again, just a couple of books that really help to inform this discussion. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has been a legend about the grieving process from the beginning, and people have come up with all kinds of other models by which to conceptualize grief, but realistically, they all tend to be rewordings or elaborations of these original theories and presentations. She's the one that came up with the 5 states of grief, but she does call them stages. And then, other more recent theories on grief and grieving have added up to 17 different states of grief, but that makes for a much longer talk, so I tend to just kind of stick to these. Here for Now is a really good, it's kind of a mixture of Dr. Rosenbaum's personal experience going through cancer and also caring for other loved ones. And she incorporates a lot of mindfulness exercises throughout the book. So even in chapter 1, by the end of the first 15 pages, you're doing mindfulness meditation exercises to really tune into what your own experience is. And I recommend that book for anyone, both going through the experience, but also in the aftermath. And then Full Catastrophe Living is, it's a pretty meaty book, but Jon Kabat-Zinn is renowned for bringing a lot of the mindfulness into the limelight and incorporating it into Western society. So that's really our talk today. And as I said, if there are things I said that upset you or things you disagree with, then when that slide arrives in your email box, just print it off and rip that page up and throw it away. But my hope is that you got something from today's talk so that you were able to just conceptualize your grieving process in a new way. But I do want to open it up for questions now. We have another half hour, and so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. We're just going to stop the recording so nobody feels self-conscious about asking the questions.